Hello, everyone. My name's Heather Sebire, and I'm called the Senior Property Curator at Stonehenge for English Heritage. So my work is very much involved with conserving the site itself. And you might think, does Stonehenge need conserving? Well, it absolutely does. And I'm going to tell you about some recent work that we did, the most major work really on the sarsen lintels since the 1950s. And you may have read about some of it in Current Archaeology in November, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit more. So here we go. So, as many of you will know, the stone circle at Stonehenge has been standing for over 4,500 years. And despite being very exposed to the elements and the weather, it has actually survived remarkably well. However, it's known that human interference has changed many of the surfaces of the stones and the stones themselves, not least with pieces being chipped off by visitors, particularly in the 19th century, when the story goes that you could actually hire a hammer at a house nearby to go and chip bits off. But as well as that, the surfaces of the stones are a remarkable record of everything that was done to them. And in 2011, we were able to commission a laser scan of every stone, which is a fantastic tool, particularly a management tool, because it shows all the working on the stones, all the damage to the stones. And then more interestingly, it showed up both prehistoric carvings and later what we call historic graffiti. So in the Bronze Age, when people who came after Stonehenge, the stone part of the site was erected, they left their mark by carving axes. I don't know if you can just see the faint marks here of a dagger and a more traditional sort of hammerhead one here. There are quite a few carved on this stone that aren't visible to the naked eye. And so we now have a fantastic record of that. And then other people came and left their mark by incising their names in the stones, something we wouldn't want people to do today, but none less than the great Sir Christopher Wren, who was the architect who built St. Paul's Cathedral. He grew up locally, but the family moved to London when he was quite young. But he did a survey of Salisbury Cathedral in his 20s, and we sort of think that he probably visited Stonehenge around that time. And so there's a cross for Christopher and Wren in one of the upright sarsens. Now, it's particularly the lintels I'm going to be talking about today, and they are the horizontal stones that sit on top of the massive uprights. And the lintels and the whole construction of Stonehenge is really one of the things that makes it unique in the prehistoric world, because it really is, some of the construction features are really quite remarkable, particularly as the people who were building Stonehenge were working in this very, very dense sandstone. So sarsen is the English word for sandstone or silcrete blocks. We now know, thanks to the work of Professor David Nash of Brighton University, that they very likely came from the West Woods on the Marlborough Downs, so over 20 miles to the north of Stonehenge. And they're very, very dense and hard to work. But the uprights have tenon joints on them. These are these sort of little knobbly bits on the top. And then the lintels have corresponding holes or mortise joints that sit on top of the tenons. And then the whole lot is toggled together, a bit like tongue and groove joints, if any of you are into carpentry. And it's very much the sort of construction that you would expect to be worked in wood rather than this very, very hard stone. And so the whole lot fits together and is slightly graduated to fit the lie of the land. So there's lintels on the outer circle, and then inside the outer circle is the horseshoe of giant trilithons. Now, trilithon just literally means three stones. It's the Greek word for three stones. And of course, this is the iconic symbol of Stonehenge, really, isn't it? The two uprights with the lintel on the top. And they're much taller than the outer circle. So it makes sense to think that they were probably erected first. And they are, the horseshoe faces down the solstice alignment of the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset behind them, focusing the monument on that solstice alignment. And here's a little stylized drawing from our guidebook to help you understand how it all fits together. Now, the lintels have fascinated people, I think, over the centuries, and it's one of the questions we get asked more than most is how did they get the lintels on the top? And I particularly remember we get all sorts of people visiting, and Ozzy Osbourne, the rock star, came with his son, and he was absolutely fascinated. He must have asked me about 20 times how they got the lintels on the top. I think this was the thing he wanted to know more than anything. Anyway, and there is a sort of historical record, if you like, of what people thought about the lintels. And this is one of my favorite manuscripts. This is Merlin, or a giant helping Merlin, fit on the lintels. This is a manuscript that's in the British Library, and well, unless you believe in giants, I think that's probably quite unlikely, but it's a lovely stylization of what they thought might have happened. And then later artists through the centuries have been fascinated, and not least Henry Moore, the sculptor and artist, who came, visited many times and sketched the stones, and seems to have been fascinated with how they were constructed and all their different features, and has a sort of dark feel to his work, and sort of implies the strength of the stones as well. And his work is in the Tate Gallery in London, or held by the Tate Gallery in London. And then here's a reconstruction drawing that we have in our guidebook with perhaps a more realistic view, because of course those people would have had rope technology and use of timber, and we were fairly sure that the uprights, the huge uprights, must have gone up by leverage, you can see going on here, and here building up so that you would have built up to get the lintels onto the top. But it certainly is fascinating that they managed to do it without our modern technology. More about that later. So the current project really goes back to the 1950s, which is when the last sort of major excavations were carried out at Stonehenge. In 1950, the Society of Antiquaries of London asked a team of 3 archaeologists, that was Richard Atkinson, Stuart Piggott, and JFS Stone, he's John Stone, but always known by his initials for some reason, to write a full and definitive volume on the archaeology of Stonehenge. And they did quite a lot of excavation over a period of about 6 years. They excavated 2 of the Aubrey holes. Those are the pits that sit inside the bank and ditch and hold cremation burials. They looked at the avenue, which connects Stonehenge to the River Avon, the heel stone, which is down near the bank and ditch, and where it meets the avenue. They looked at part of the bank and ditch itself, which we think is around about 3000 BC, and a portion of the bluestone circle. The bluestones are the second main geology on the site, and those are the stones that we know came from South Wales and are subject of lots of research going on at the moment. Bluestone, of course, an antiquarian term. They do look slightly blue when they're very wet, some of them in particular. And I'd just like to point out, if any of you are interested in the details of the last 100 years of conservation and restoration at Stonehenge, we have a series of blogs on our website, and some of what I've just read out to you is from one by my colleague Susan Greeny. And this is, you can read those blogs if you go onto the English Heritage website. So in this picture, here is Richard Atkinson in the trench with his team excavating. He quite often has a pipe in his mouth, which we wouldn't encourage today for all sorts of reasons. And here they are having a good look at around where some of the bluestones that aren't visible today actually can be seen. And then following the excavation, and I think one of the reasons might have been because the excavation was so extensive, it sort of imbued in people the thought that really Stonehenge should be reconstructed. And the chief architect at the time was a man called Aubrey Woodman Bailey. I don't think any relation to Sir John Aubrey, but I'd like you to bear him in mind. He's this gentleman in the white boiler suit here, again with a pipe in his mouth. And they're inspecting the top of the lintels on the outer stone circle. This is quite amusing to us today because, of course, we have to be very aware of health and safety. And we wouldn't be allowed to go up on the lintels without high-vis jackets, hard hats, steel toe cap boots, and of course a way of getting down safely, either ladders or scaffold tower, as you'll see in a minute. But that's how things were done in those days. And they decided to fill some of the cracks, natural cracks in the lintels with mortar, and some of the joints as well. And at the time, some of the stones were actually rebedded in concrete. Some of the big upright sarsens were rebedded in concrete as well. The problem really was, in those days, it was the normal thing to use a mortar with cement mixed into it. And over time, that will crack and fail. And that was partly what we were looking at. But when you look back at some of the pictures of what went on, here's how you erect a lintel in the 1950s. They decided to re-erect a whole trilithon, among other things. And again, here they are with not much sign of any health and safety kit as we would have to wear today. But the other thing is that they had to borrow this giant crane called a Brabazon crane from Boscombe Down, which is the RAF station just slightly to the southeast of Stonehenge. And we decided to try and do a little bit of oral history to try and find people who may have been connected with the excavations or the reconstruction work. And we were delighted that we tracked down Councillor David Healy of Durrington Council. Many of you know that Durrington is just up to the northeast, the small well, village, really, I suppose, and very close to Durrington Walls and Woodhenge. And he was able to tell us all about the day that he and a colleague were asked to go to Stonehenge to actually drive this huge crane. And we've got some parts of what he said to us, again, on our website. If you look for oral histories on the English Heritage website, you can hear all about his experiences on the day. He was only there for one day, but it was absolutely fascinating hearing a bit more detail about what went on then. So jumping now into the 21st century, after all that work in the last century, in the 1950s, at the time when Professor David Nash was looking at the geology of the sarsens, he needed to have a scaffold tower to be able to get up to the lintels as well as the uprights. And so we took the opportunity to ask Historic England's engineering team, structural engineering team, to have a look at Stonehenge, because although we were fairly sure it was structurally sound, and of course, don't forget that what survives today is in a very ruinous condition anyway, but I just wanted the peace of mind to know that from an engineering point of view, there was nothing of concern. And so in 2019, at the same time as the geology work was going on, engineers from Historic England were able to examine the lintels and the sarsens, well, all the stones really, and give me a report on what they thought, if anything needed doing. The good news was there was no structural concerns, but they did recommend some non-urgent works on the lintels, which unfortunately got delayed like many things because of the pandemic. But it was mainly to do with removing some of the cement mortar because a lot of it had cracked and weathered underneath the lintels. And the lintel that was put back that you saw in those previous pictures, number 158, had actually been pinned together and then mortared here. Here's some cracking mortar. And we wanted to check that the pinning was still secure as well. So we decided to draw up a project to replace the cement mortar from the lintels from the time of the 1950s, and check the pinning, particularly in 158, and there was a little bit of pinning in 122 as well. And I was just going to mention that the stones all have numbers, and those numbers were actually given to them by the great antiquarian Sir Flinders Petrie, who's really famous for his Egyptology work, his work in Egypt. But he actually numbered all the stones, starting at the axis of the monument and continuing in a clockwise direction. And although some are missing, he numbered all of them, and the lintels as well, and the altar stone. And we still actually use those numbers today. So it is quite useful to have those as a sort of system that everybody uses at the same time. Now, because Stonehenge is a scheduled ancient monument, we of course had to seek consent from Historic England and through them by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS. So we worked with the inspector, Melanie Barge from the Bristol office, who came and we talked through what we wanted to do with her, and we were granted consent to carry out the work. And we commissioned Sally Strachey Conservation, who are very experienced conservation contractors, particularly with historic buildings, and but they were very pleased to come and help us out with repointing Stonehenge rather than a historic building. Now, we had to think about what the methodology was going to be and how we were going to do it. And we wanted to take out the loose and eroded and cracked mortar from the gaps between the stones. And the contractors only used hand tools. We didn't want to use any mechanical tools or electrical tools. But one of the other things was that we had to take great care with what mortar we were putting back in. Now, many of you might be thinking, why did you use mortar at all? There would have been no mortar 4,500 years ago. But because that work had been done in the 1950s, we felt it was only sensible, and also to try and protect the parts of the stone circle that do survive today, to use a mortar that would be much more sympathetic though. So Strachey's worked up these boards of different types of mortar because we were particularly interested in the color and the texture that might match the stones themselves. Now, you know, when you look at pictures of Stonehenge or when you go, you tend to think you're looking at grey stones. You know, the old joke, how many shades of grey are there? But anyway, but in fact, there is a huge range of color even within the sarsens. And some of you might be interested to know that some of our interpretation features that mark missing stones, we've got some for the station stones, for example, and the partner to the heel stone, they are actually polished sarsen. And if you have a look at those the next time you're there, you'll see that they look very different. They're almost more a pinky sort of beigey color, but the uprights, because they're exposed to the elements, they do tend to be more gray in color, and they do have different textures as well. But we took these boards down to the site itself and put it against, held them against the stones and had a conversation about which ones we thought were the most appropriate. And we chose one that seemed to be the best. They tend to look quite light when they first go in, but they will weather down and match the stones as well. And the thing about lime mortar is that it is a very traditional material, and it breathes. So any moisture that gets held within the stones will be able to escape, unlike modern cements, which are very brittle and don't breathe really and don't let the water escape. And of course, the other thing that's on the stones that's a major feature and loved by many people is that they are covered by lichens, which are air plants that grow on the stones. And we wanted to very much protect the lichens as well while the work was going on. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what did we actually do? So here's a stylized form of what survives of Stonehenge itself in terms of the stone part of the monument. And here's that numbering system I was telling you about. And the dark grey stones are the ones that are upright, and the lighter grey ones are ones that are fallen or recumbent, as we would call it. And so we asked Strachey's to check, first of all. We were taking a very minimalist approach. We didn't want to plaster mortar where mortar wasn't needed. And so the first thing we did was ask Strachey's to actually do an examination to actually tell us which stones they thought really needed checking and mortaring. There were, as you can see, there's quite a few here that did. And then we also wanted to look at the skyward facing lintels, because let's face it, they're the ones that take the full brunt of the weather. And just reminded myself that I should have mentioned at the beginning that, of course, the other thing that we've got to be very concerned about, not least after the storms of earlier this week, is that climate change is definitely causing more extreme weather, even here in the British Isles. We get what I call rain events when it rains really heavily for quite a long time. And so all those natural features on the top of the skyward facing lintels are gathering water, which sits, and you can actually see, and then of course it dries out and sometimes it freezes, and you can actually see that it is causing erosion. Now, obviously this erosion is going to take a very long time, but even so, I think it's the responsible thing to try and stop the erosion if we can, or at least delay the erosion, if you like. And so we looked at some, and there was one in particular that had been extensively mortared, and you could hardly see it. Here it is covered in moss as well as the mortar. But when the mortar came out, you can see all these natural fissures. And we think that it was probably, they just thought it was better to absolutely fill it with mortar in the 1950s. So that all came out, but we've just put back as just a small amount to try and even off, to try and really disperse the water from sitting on the top. There was one other quirky thing that was discovered. There was one tenon joint under one of the outer lintels around here that had actually been covered in lead. And this did seem to be quite unusual. But we reminded ourselves that it is recorded that in the early 1900s, so way before the excavations in the 1950s, after Colonel Hawley's excavations, the Ministry of Works at the time thought it might be sensible to lead over the tenon joints to try and make sure that the mortise of the lintels fitted on better. I mean, in a historic building or a historic church, you would use lead to try and disperse water. But it did seem rather a funny thing for Stonehenge. And it turned out that they had been doing work at Hampton Court in London at the same time. And we think that the lead for this work had come from Hampton Court. So rather obscure connection between Stonehenge and Hampton Court. But they only actually did one upright in the end, and they must have decided either they thought it was too expensive because of the lead, or they realized that it wasn't really a very sensible thing to do. But the lead is still in position today, which can be seen. But anyway, and then back to the lichens. So we wanted to make sure we protected the lichens, and we had recent lichen surveys, one back in 2004 and one in 2017, which although there had been changes in other places in lowland England, there weren't any major changes at Stonehenge itself. And in fact, there had been a very recent survey where two new species had been discovered. That was some preparatory work that Highways England were doing in advance of the possible changes to the A303. And lichenologists were very pleased to see that the lichens at Stonehenge seemed to be thriving. But we did ask David Hill, a lichenologist, to give us some advice about how to protect them, and Straight Cheese made sure they were covered with polythene just on a temporary basis while they were putting the lime mortar in place. And so they weren't damaged at all in the work. And this picture is just one of the maritime lichens, because one of the unusual things about the lichens at Stonehenge is they do include maritime species. And although we're not that far from the south coast, Southampton wouldn't be that far away, 25, 30 miles, it does seem quite unusual that there are maritime species at Stonehenge. But I can assure you that the lichens were fully respected and protected while the work was going on. But then there was another consideration back to the geology and Professor David Nash and his work on the sarsens, because when we were talking about taking out the mortar, I have to confess, it hadn't occurred to me. I thought it was just a good thing to take all that mortar out because it was cementitious, it was full of cement. But he did express an interest in seeing some of the mortar, because under his microscope, he could see if any sarsen survived at a chemical level and at a microscopic level on the mortar itself. And so he has we've given him some samples of the mortar where it looked sort of some of the it looked shiny in places, which may have indicated that some of the sarsen itself may have attached itself to the mortar. So he's currently looking at that. And then I was quite surprised one day to see these flint nodules on one of the skyward facing lintels. And it hadn't occurred to me that this was quite well, not as unusual as I thought it was. I don't know if you can just see the ambery coloured nodules of flint here, because of course Professor Nash reminded me that sarsen is a form of sandstone, which of course are made up of marine sediments and would have been formed, under the sea many millions of years ago. And so it's quite a nice feature that some of these flint nodules are becoming visible within the sarsen, the very dense sandstone itself. And oh, excuse me, it gives a lot more texture and color. So it's back again to thinking that they're not just gray, that with the lichens and flint nodules and the matrix of the stone itself, they really are quite colorful stones. So it was quite good that we were able to involve Professor Nash in the work as well. And then at English Heritage, we do like to tell people what is going on. And we were slightly concerned about when we were going to do the work, because we didn't want to spoil a visit for people, particularly people who were coming as a one-off, to see Stonehenge, just like we might go and see the Great Wall of China or the pyramids or wherever. We didn't want to spoil anyone's visit. But we really did need to work during daylight hours. So the contractors worked on a scaffold tower, which wasn't too intrusive. And a lot of the time they were working out of sight of the public anyway. But we wanted to tell the public what we were doing and try and engage them with the work, engage them. And with the use of volunteers, we did explain to the public. We drew up these boards explaining what we were doing, some at the visitor centre itself and some down at the Stone Circle. And the general public were incredibly interested and were really quite, almost excited to see the work going on and to know that, Stonehenge is being well looked after, so to speak. So we were very, very pleased, and we were very thankful to our wonderful volunteer group who stood out in all weathers and told the public what was going on and engaged with everyone. So that was part of the work as well. And I can assure you that the lime mortar and the pinning was all inspected, the mortar's all gone in and will be monitored from time to time. Most of it you can't see with the naked eye, but we just know that Stonehenge is well secured for hopefully another few thousand years. But there is just one final part of the story, which is quite interesting and fun as well. So if you remember back to that inspection of the lintels with those four gentlemen right up on the top of the lintels, and in particular, the architect at the time, the chief architect of the Ministry of Works, Mr. Aubrey Woodman Bailey, well, in the school holidays, his son, Richard, was able to go and join him at Stonehenge. And here he is examining what we assume is one of his father's working drawings of what was going on with the restoration at the time. And there's one of the lintels being lifted by the crane that I mentioned before as well, and lots of people watching on. We probably did have as many people watching what we were doing recently last year, but this drew great attention. And we had already been in touch with Richard, the son of Aubrey Woodman Bailey, because he had told us that he had information about his father's work and a few papers from the time. And so he had reminded us that he had put a coin underneath one of the uprights when he was 8 years old. His father had, and he had organized to put a coin underneath the lintel. Now, we weren't in the business of lifting the huge sarsen uprights or the lintel itself, but we invited Richard to come and put a new coin in the mortar underneath the lintel that sits on top of the upright that he put the coin under. And we were delighted that the Royal Mint were so interested in this story that they actually minted, struck, I think the word is, isn't it? A new coin with 2021 on it for Richard to put in the mortar. And here's James from Straight Cheese with some mortar and Richard putting the coin in just above where he put it in 1958. So that was lovely. He was delighted to come back and happy to put the coin in. And we did ask permission from Historic England because it's a modern intrusion, but as it was going in the mortar, they were quite happy. It'll survive as long as the mortar does. So that was just a nice rounding up of the story, if you like, from the work in the 1950s to what we were doing today. So thank you very much for listening. I can assure you Stonehenge is secured now. Here I am at the scaffold with James from Strachey, and I must be honest, it was a great thing to be able to go up and see the uprights, particularly the inner horseshoe of trilithons from that height, and all the different features and how the stone looks right up close. So it was very interesting, and we got some really nice photography as well. It's a very good time to come and visit us. If you haven't been recently, do come and visit. It's still quite quiet after the pandemic. We hope to welcome back visitors from overseas again soon, but certainly if you're local, it's a very good time to come and visit because it's quite quiet. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about our lintel conservation at Stonehenge. Thank you.